All right, let's cut right to the chase, straight out of the gate. What is the psychoanalyst's knowledge? There's an easy answer to this. It's one you've probably heard before, and we might as well just start there. The psychoanalyst's knowledge is knowledge of the unconscious as an unknown field of knowledge, and one whose function is often just as obscure. What you have here is knowledge of ignorance, yours and mine alike. And this is the best part about it. This knowledge of ignorance also ultimately translates into a knowledge of powerlessness. We'll get there. For now, though, let's just start with the unconscious, with this field and function of unknown knowledge, before asking what exactly the psychoanalyst knows about it, which is more precisely, as you may have guessed, a question about where the psychoanalyst knows about it and how. They give it what Lacan calls a transmissible formulation. It's one of the key phrases in this opening session in the book Talking to Brick Walls on the Psychoanalyst's Knowledge. This transmissible formulation. It's on page 32. But back to the unconscious. The unconscious is logical, grammatical, structural, and in all of these ways, linguistic. Here I'm just summing up a lot of what you've already heard, I'm certain, and a lot of what's popping here in this opening lecture. And its operation in each of these ways is primarily repetitive. Repetition, if there's a trope that pops in the unconscious, it's that. What then does the unconscious repeat? It repeats the impossible. It repeats the real. It repeats the sexual. All that's forbidden, all that is off limits, all that is prohibited, even the fact of prohibition itself is repeated. How do unconscious repetitions of the impossible, the forbidden, the sexual, and prohibition itself find expression? As symptoms, of course. When the real takes a name, as we described it in our previous series, in the symbolic, we see a symptomatic expression. What do we mean by symptom here? Well, at this point in Lacan's thought, early 1970s, a symptom is still a signifier, but it is wildly enigmatic. It's an enigmatic signifier about whose meaning we neither know nor understand anything. Here, the symptom, you might think, is midway between Lacan's early work on signifiers and his later work on synthomes. Here we're midway between the symptom as a signifier that is interpretable and the symptom as a synthome that is unanalyzable. At this point, in 1971, Lacan is thinking around symptom somewhere in between, hence the emphasis on its enigmatic status. At this point, I would suggest that we can do well and make much headway in Lacan's thought by thinking of symptomatic expressions exactly as Lacan does, as litter, as debris, as fragments of refuse washing up on a beach, the beach of speech. That line of litter that you see at the high water mark on any beach, the high tide line, if you want to call it that. I'm talking about kelp, old bottles, bits of plastic, broken cords, lengths of line, feathers, flip-flops, kelp and more kelp, tangled up around dead deer with their heads peeled back, eye missing, half their fur gone and all their hooves, spray painted red. Where did that come from? How did it get like that? What does its presence here in this state mean? Or if you want to think about this, not in the sea but in the heavens, you could imagine any sort of curious atmospheric phenomena. This is exactly where Lacan starts his previous seminar, Seminar 18, on clouds, thunder, all sorts of bizarre cosmic events and entities. the wind couples with the tectonic groans of the earth, and each serve as symptoms. The tectonic groans of the earth in the age of fracking are symptomatic expressions, not of a human sort, and not of sorts that we can even truly hear, beyond our sonic range. So also with the fiery flits of the hummingbird across your garden. But let's be definitive. Symptoms are enigmatic signifiers, period. Actually, let's turn it into a commie. Symptoms are enigmatic signifiers, comma, and they are commanded by the unconscious. This unknown field of knowledge is the command structure that through linguistic structures, typically repetitive ones, repetition unto death. Fuck sickness unto death. We're talking about repetition unto death. Burst out with symptoms. So symptoms are enigmatic signifiers commanded by the unconscious. Let's cap it there for just a second and get back to this command center, this unconscious. Here in Lacan's opening lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge, his account of the unconscious is a rather familiar one. According to Lacan, there are two types of knowledge. You've known this since the 1950s with him, and now here we are 15 years later, and he's kind of returning this topic. In fact, you could even say that part of what Lacan is doing in 1970 and 1971 is effectively rewriting his essay on the instance of the letter in the unconscious. He's updating it at the beach. These two types of knowledge that you've been hearing him talk off and on about since the mid-50s are back again in this essay. One is Cartesian and the other is Freudian. And you can see where the unconscious is going to link up here. You've probably heard this before, so let's keep it brief. When folks talk about knowledge, they typically mean Cartesian knowledge, which means conscious knowledge, knowledge of which we are aware, the underlying presupposition of which is what made Descartes famous. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This is what we typically mean when we think of knowledge. At issue here, in this typical understanding of knowledge, is not just consciousness, though. Unfortunately, that's typically where the conversation ends. Lacan, I think, is very keen to point out, even if only indirectly, and perhaps I'm reading this into him, but listen, cogito ergo sum is not just about consciousness and being aware of knowledge. It's also about consistency. To know something in this typical conception of knowledge is to know that you possess that knowledge and to have a consistency between those two structures. So, I know how to swim, and I know this about myself. I am aware of my ability to swim. They are consistent. And I bring this awareness with me whenever I go to the beach. Notice how Lacan puts this. It's on page 16 of the text that we're working with here. A very accessible text, I might add. Here's the bit about consistency. The consistency of knowledge, that means that when one knows something, the least one can say about it is that one knows it. That's the core of it. And for Lacan, he means this is the core of Cartesian approaches to knowledge. I think, therefore I am. Some heavy daubing shapes an ego around that. Namely, the one who knows that he knows is the ego. So the ego emerges as this cogito, this fantastical, delusional figure that knows that it knows. It's clear that this reference to the ego is secondary in relation to the fact that a knowledge is known, and that the novelty that psychoanalysis reveals is that this is a knowledge that is unknown to itself. So Lacan's point here is that the ego is not just secondary to Cartesian structures of knowledge, but it's also secondary to this other knowledge, which we'll come to in just a minute. If conscious knowledge is the known sort, known knowledge. We could say that unconscious knowledge is what Lacan here calls unknown knowledge. Knowledge we possess unbeknownst to ourselves. Consider, for instance, the well-worn storyline in action movies where the hero begins the movie in a state of, I don't know, like some kind of fucking amnesia, without any awareness of the extensive martial arts training and killing instincts that have been bred into them by the military, by the CIA, by some other organization, only to then discover in a moment of crisis, when their bone-deep martial arts training kicks in, much to their own surprise, bewilderment, concern, to say nothing of those around them, and boom, oh my God, that's Jason Bourne. You see, this would be a decent illustration to begin. Unknown knowledge and its sudden recall. What else is the lost and found taekwondo move but a symptom? Now, we could conclude here, but we could also do better. It's tempting to stop and to conclude here that we thus have two types of knowledge, both equally valid if mutually exclusive. There's the known knowledge, and then there's this unknown knowledge. There's first consciousness, and then we have something that is unconscious. That, however, would fall significantly short of Freud's revolutionary insight. Unknown knowledge in the field of the unconscious subverts known knowledge, and with it, the modern philosophical enterprise of human consciousness. That is truer to Freud's insight. It's not just that you have conscious and unconscious living together if separate lives. Nah, man. The discovery of the unconscious is the discovery of a whole in the field of conscious inquiry that prevents that inquiry from completion. Because we're always a bit unconscious, we can't ever be fully aware, is the point. We can't ever be fully tuned in, cognizant of ourselves or the world around us, much less what we think we know. The ego always has a blind spot. Consciousness always comes up short. And its fantasy of consistency, completion, and the like, it always falls apart in the final analysis. Why? Because there's always something unknowable at work, at play, wandering errantly through the field of knowledge. At issue here, Lacan says, and I want to be clear about this because it's coming straight from the text, is a subversion that is produced in the function, in the structure of knowledge. It's on page 17, just after what we were reading. You can check it out. But I don't want to turn to that passage. Instead, I want you to imagine something. If you need an image or a diagram of how this starts to play out, these two knowledges with the unconscious marking a hole or a rupture in the field of knowledge, here's how you could do it. Grab a sheet of paper, draw a circle in the middle of it, and inside this circle, anywhere inside this circle, draw another smaller circle and then shade it in. The big circle is known knowledge, knowledge of which we are conscious. And the smaller circle is unknown knowledge, knowledge of which we are unaware, knowledge which marks a hole in consciousness. Now, you might head to some chicken or egg thinking at this point, which came first, the whole or the structure of knowledge around it? Well, obviously you can't have a whole unless you've got some sort of a structure around it. Just like you can't have the interior of a vase in all of its emptiness until you as a vase maker have shaped it out of clay or whatever. I don't want to think, though, of this whole as being a result or an effect of knowledge either. In fact, what I would suggest is that the whole in knowledge and the structure of knowledge that emerges and is structured around it, they are reciprocally constitutive. You can't have one without the other. I think that's a much safer thought than asking which has priority. They are reciprocally constitutive instead. When Freud comes along and discovers the unconscious, I believe this is what he discovers. He discovers that there is an epistemological hole in every episteme, a hole in knowledge that makes every knowledge, every discipline, every discourse formation ever incomplete, ever inconsistent, limited, and the like. According to Lacan, this new status of knowledge, and I'm quoting from pages 17 to 18 in our text, must entail a new type of discourse, one that is not easy to maintain, Lacan says, and which up to a certain point has yet to begin. So what Freud discovered in the field of knowledge, this hole in knowledge marked by the unconscious, according to Lacan, this warrants the development of a new discourse, a discourse that is not easy to sustain, and that really, at this point in 1970, 71, still hasn't begun. I believe this is exactly why Lacan opens this session on the psychoanalyst's knowledge on the topic of ignorance. Initially, it looks like he's going to discuss ignorance as a passion of sorts. It's a familiar theme. You've probably encountered this elsewhere and in the secondary literature. But then notice what happens. Lacan pivots to the question of ignorance and its relation to knowledge. Right at the start, right out of the gates here. Ignorance, as you've often heard me say, is knowledge's most elaborate form. You've probably read this in Lacan too. I didn't just make that shit up. Here, in November 1971, Lacan is back at it. And again, right at the start. Join me on page 5 of this text. A certain cardinal, at a time when this title was not a certificate of knowledge, gave the term docta ignorantia, translation as learned ignorance, to the highest form of knowledge. To remind you in passing, his name was Nicholas Casuanus. We need to start from this correlation between ignorance and knowledge. What is this docta ignorantia that Lacan begins his discussion of the psychoanalyst knowledge about? You heard me translate it from the Latin as learned ignorance if you like. It's a Latin expression designed to show the limits of human knowledge. And you can trace it back to St. Augustine of Hippo, all the way up to Bonaventura, and all the way up to this figure, Nicholas of Cusa, who notably, Lacan doesn't touch on this, traces it all the way back to Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, in his first letter to Corinth. God loves the foolish to shame the wise, Paul writes. God loves the weak to shame the strong. God loves the lowly and despised, the things that are not. It's one of the best parts in Corinthians 1. The things that are not, God loves them in order to nullify all that is, so that no one may boast. And guess what, motherfuckers? God also loves the ignorant, ever to shame the knowledgeable. Now, up to Cusa's work, which is like 1440, mid-1400s here, this phrase, this notion, it was thoroughly theological. It was mystical. It was more about human relations to the infinite, the eternal, Holy Spirit, God, stuff like that, than anything else. XIXa is significant, which makes Lacan's reference to him all the more so, because he makes this doctrine of learned ignorance more about scientific inquiry. And his point is that epistemologies are always limited, incomplete, lacking, and imperfect, or at least that's the starting point. Because this has implications also for our access to truth. We can know the truth, but only impartially, incompletely, and in a limited fashion. Let me be clear, and let me try and schematize this theme with which Lacan begins his discussion of the psychoanalyst knowledge. This doctrine of learned ignorance, this docta ignorantia, says the following: rational knowledge is simply inadequate to the task of grasping the infinite. Now, you can call that God, you can call that truth, you can name it as you like. And as such, rational knowledge is always passing over into, giving way to ignorance, which is a kind of infra-rationality, not super-rationality, alter-rationality, if you like. And this, according to XIXa, with whom Lacan is in agreement, is the highest form of knowledge. The highest form of knowledge is the point at which knowledge passes over into something else. The highest point of knowledge that we have access to is ignorance. And here's the thing about that kind of ignorance. We have to learn it. We have to learn this about knowledge. Ignorance is an accomplishment, something in which you can be trained. You can be trained to find the outer limits of any given epistemology. In order to understand the psychoanalyst knowledge, we've got to start right here with an understanding, and let me be clear about this also, an appreciation for knowledge as limited, incomplete, imperfect, partial, and the like. At issue here is not a celebration of ignorance or the unlearned, but instead a concerted effort to learn about the limits of one's own knowledge. That's what docta ignorantia is about. A concerted effort to study, to learn, and to become more aware about the limits of one's knowledge, and to cultivate an appreciation for these limits. I would even say a love of these limits. And for those of you that have been following this series from Seminar 17 into Seminar 18 and now up to here, you know where I'm going with this love of limitation, this love of weakness, this love of ignorance that ultimately, when we lift its veil, is a love of castration. And all without superstition. This is crucial. Without allowing superstition, note Lacan also cues this up on page 5, to rush in and cover this field of ignorance, account for this field of ignorance, to fill in the holes of knowledge with godly plans, earthly conspiracies, and other paranoid fantasies of omniscience, anything to plug that hole. Part of what is happening here in Lacan's first pass at the psychoanalyst knowledge is that you have a studied, learned appreciation for the limits of knowledge, the holes in knowledge, a love of this incompletion, to such an extent that even if you had a chance to plug that hole, you wouldn't. You don't give in to the superstitions that Lacan here indicts medicine for. For some time now, ignorance in medicine has not been sufficiently learned for the latter to survive on anything other than superstition. That's where I'm building this out of. It's also on page 5. Before Freud, we were simply uninstructed in the ways of the unconscious. We were ignorant of its field and its function alike, which is not to say it didn't exist, which is not to say that we didn't suffer as a result, which is not to say we didn't accomplish great breakthroughs for self and society alike by way of the unconscious. It just means that we were uninstructed in its ways prior to Freud. And after Freud, it's difficult to ignore these ways. It's difficult to ignore the fact that there is much about ourselves of which we are unaware. That's ultimately what this comes down to keep it as simple and coherent as possible. To become aware of this unawareness, conscious of the unconscious, if you will, and to learn about its operational logic is to acquire learned ignorance, docta ignorantia, in the psychoanalytic tradition. I think this is precisely where Lacan is headed in this opening riff on the psychoanalyst knowledge. The psychoanalyst knowledge is a knowledge of ignorance. And in the paragraph between the one you just heard me read about medicine and its superstition, and the one that he offers around Nicholas Cusanus, is this one. If at a certain point in a certain region, ignorance brings knowledge down to its lowest level, the low tide, this is not the fault of ignorance. It's even the opposite. This is the most crucial paragraph on page 5. The psychoanalyst knowledge is a knowledge of ignorance which brings knowledge down to its lowest level. And this is not the fault of ignorance, but in fact the opposite. What does he mean by this? I read this as suggesting that humbling knowledge, hobbling knowledge, is in fact the proper function, not the lamentable fault of learned ignorance. As you probably know, Lacan had been working in this direction for a long time. This didn't just come out of nowhere, as in all of his thoughts. In fact, I dare say Lacan never had a breakthrough, because each of his breakthroughs were these incremental, slight adjustments, tweaks to things he had already been working on. It's truly an organic thinker, if ever there was one. At this point, he had also been working toward this insight about humbling knowledge, hobbling knowledge, for years. It really begins to come into focus for him, I believe, in Seminar 14. And the set theoretical insight that he arrives at there, that the big other, as a whole, complete, consistent, all-inclusive, totalizing structure, doesn't exist, technically speaking, for reasons that we've discussed at length in our previous series. You can go back and check it out. It's all available to you. Then, a few years later, in seminars 16 and 17, Lacan extends this insight about the non-existence of the big other to knowledge. Knowledge is also a field of incompletion, and again for reasons that we've discussed at length, particularly in our series on 16 and coming into focus sharply in our series on 17. Knowledge for Lacan, let's be clear, is never incomplete, wholly consistent, or all-inclusive. It's less a product or a result than a process or an operation. And that's really crucial. That's one of the crucial shifts that he makes relative to knowledge. It's not a finished product or the result of some inquiries of sorts, some disciplinary agenda. No, knowledge is a process, an open-ended process that has a very specific operational logic that occurs when it encounters these holes or these limits within its own system. Think back to that circle you drew and the one in the middle shaded out, which we'll come to and expand upon in a moment. Knowledge for Lacan is less a product or a result than a process or an operation. That's what I want you to keep your mind on here. And it's right at the front of Seminar 17 if you want to study this further. And knowledge is an operation or a process whose structural logic, again, is open-ended. It opens up onto the unknown, onto entities, events, and experiences that relative to its epistemic awareness are wildly ulterior, downright impossible, which is to say, real. This may be why Lacan turns to luck just a few pages later. I find this fascinating. This turn he makes to luck. It's self-aggrandizing as hell, which I don't mind. It's kind of par for the course in reading this guy. But it's just fascinating what he does with luck here. Check this out. That's at the bottom of page 8, top of page 9. Changing the seat of knowledge is not the kind of thing that just happens overnight, kind of like a so-called breakthrough in Lacan's thought. The future belongs to God, as they say. That is, to good luck. The good luck of those who had the bright idea of following me. Something will come of them, so long as the boogeyman doesn't get them. This is what I call good luck. For the rest, good luck is out of the question. Their doings will be settled by automatism, which is the exact opposite of luck, good or hard. What the hell does this mean? We're lucky enough to be following Lacan, and good luck is going to follow us, and we're not going to slip into automatism? That's the giveaway. Learned ignorance, from Freud to Lacan, leaves room for luck, chance, touche, encounters with the real. So think back to Seminar 11, touche, automaton, and what he's doing, always, it seems, in reference to Aristotle. Learned ignorance leaves room for luck. And as a result, you have two types of analysts, two types of psychoanalytic thinkers. There are those who leave room for luck, and there are those who don't. In the gaps of fortune, chance, and touche, the latter all too often cultivate superstition. Call it archetype, call it spirit, call it soul, call it whatever the hell you want. In place of luck, they traffic in superstition. To follow Lacan, he suggests here, is to always leave room in analytic experience as well as scientific inquiry for chance. In the gaps of which knowledge is made, Lacanians know how to catch lucky breaks. If fortune favors the prepared, also hearkening back to Aristotle, Lacan would have us be ready in theory and technique alike. What's all this amount to? Luck, chance, touche, the real, these are all figures of truth for Lacan. And it's here, by returning to the topic of truth, that we stand to learn what Lacan means by the psychoanalyst's knowledge, at least in this opening lecture. Truth is not knowledge, Lacan reminds us on page 10. There is, however, a palpable frontier between them, and this is key. Because it's on this frontier between truth and knowledge that we find that discourse, that new discourse that has yet to be sustained, much less begun. It's on this frontier between truth and knowledge, Lacan is explicit on this point, that we find the analytic discourse. So when Lacan says that the status of knowledge after Freud's momentous discovery of the unconscious as unknown knowledge requires a new type of discourse, one that's difficult to maintain and in many ways has yet to even be started, It's the discourse of the analyst that he has in mind. It's the analytic discourse, the small daddy of the four. To put us on the path that wends its way through the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge, a frontier, mind you, that we've traversed before, most remarkably in our last series on Seminar 18, Chapter 7 in particular, on this eraser land that is the beach. Recall what you already know about Lacan's theory of discourse, because the goal here is to really figure out how the analytic discourse occupies this frontier between truth and knowledge. And that in and of itself is a multi-part problem that will require some new thinking around the diagram you've already started with these two circles and one in the center or around the center that has been shaded out. We have to rethink the relationship between truth and knowledge in such a way that allows for a frontier to emerge between them and the discourse of the analyst to take shape there. In order to do that, though, let's take a second, because our goal here is always clear, coherent, and accessible accounts of what Lacan is up to. Let's take a minute then and back up and think about Lacan's theory of discourse as it appears in that little four-footed animal that he trots out in the late 1960s. And here you might just get out another sheet of paper and draw two lines, one line right next to the other, two horizontal lines right next to each other. And you know the diagram I'm working with here. Above the line to the left, write agent. Below it, write truth. Above the line on the right, write other. And below it, write product. And then to make this thing fly, draw an arrow from agent to other, a little curvy arrow from other to product, insert a triangle between truth and product, and then draw a final arrow leading from truth up to agent, so that it looks something like this. Some of you are just listening, which is why I describe this. For those of you who are seeing the video, you can see the diagram I'm holding up. It's a standard blueprint for Lacan's theory of discourse. It really is a map, if you will. Let's keep this brief and schematic because we've been over this before. Truth in this diagram is the unconscious condition of possibility for the semblance of agency, here's your agent, that allows someone to address someone else, and in so doing, to produce something, a communicative result of sorts, for the former's surplus enjoyment. Now that's, maybe too schematic here, but you can take this one step at a time and work it through. Truth, here at the bottom, is the condition of possibility for the semblance of agency that you see above it. An agency that allows someone, whoever occupies this position as agent, to address someone else. There's that arrow. That arrow pointing from agent to other is an arrow of addressivity. And in so doing, by addressing someone else, there will be a product. Something will be resulting from this. That's this arrow that points from other down to product. And this product is typically something for the surplus enjoyment of the agent, whose semblance of agency initiated its production. If you want examples of this, figured in terms of classic Lacanian discourses of analyst, hysteric, university master, and the like, head back to our series on Seminar 17, Seminar 18. I don't have time to go back into it. I wish I did, but we just don't have that amount of time. The whole idea behind having all this stuff available is so that you can always go back and catch up and review stuff, but I'm trying to build on things we've already discussed. There are examples there. You can even go and study discourses on the hysteric. It's separate lectures just on each. For now, though, I'm moving fast and schematically because we got somewhere we need to be. What you'll see if you go back and review these previous series, in addition to lots of illustrations and key passages, some of which I have top of mind as I talk to you today, what you'll see there is an emphasis on this triangle that we have yet to discuss. This triangle between truth and product in the little four-footed animal. I believe, as you well know, that this is the central feature of what Lacan is doing with discourse. This triangle, this delta, he calls it in Seminar 17 the delta of impotence. And it has proven crucial to our readings of Seminar 17 and 18. I dare say it is the algebraic symbol that has allowed us to crack those seminars open and read out of them new ways of thinking with Lacan. I think that it's equally relevant here in Lacan's opening lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge. Let's see if we can work this through. Between the cause and effect, the truth and the product of any given discursive practice, there's a barrier, a limit, something insurmountable. And notice how I'm putting this here. Truth is the cause of the semblance of agency that allows someone to speak. That's why there's an arrow pointing from truth to agent, because truth is the cause. The product of their address to another person, with this arrow from other to product, marks an effect structure. Truth causes the agency to have an ability to speak. And when they speak to another, there is an effect. That's what that indicates. So you have a cause and an effect. The cause of one person and the effect of them addressing someone else. And between these causes and effects, these truths and products, what you see is a barrier, a limit, something insurmountable. Think of this triangle between truth and product, cause and effect, as a mountain range. It's not a bad way to do this. Some students have also been inclined to think of it as a Bermuda Triangle of sorts, which I like because I'm always trying to take us out to sea. But here, a mountain range works because it really captures the sense of a barrier, something insurmountable, a significant obstruction. Something that, let me be clear, when we encounter it, always meets with the same response. Here, I can go no further. Beyond this point, my path is blocked. That's what this delta of impotence means. It means that you can't pass it. And you can say as much as well. And that's also crucial here. Because these are all statements of incapacity, pronouncements of weakness, admissions of impotence, declarations of impossibility. And they are not irrelevant. In fact, they are the most important part, even more important than the insurmountability that we encounter in the delta of impotence is our ability to name that insurmountability. In short, our ability to name the real. That is what's happening in those moments. When you meet that barrier that cannot be passed, and you say, here I can go no further, beyond this point my path is blocked, what you're doing is naming the real. And these names are also statements of truth, which, as you know, is on the other side of that mountain range. These are significations of the part of truth that can be said. And the part of truth that always says the same thing. There is another part of truth which cannot be said. And this is all I can say about that. So you know Lacan has a theory of truth that says there are parts of it that can be said and parts of it that can't be said. And what I'm suggesting here is that we should note the parts of truth that can be said always say the same thing, which is what you just heard me say. That there's this other part beyond my ability to speak. There's this other part of truth that cannot be said. And this is truly all I can say about that other part. Now, you just slow down and think through that, and you have the type of discourse that you hear at the base of that insurmountable mountain of impotence. Impotence because you are unable, incapable, cannot go further past that point. Impotence doesn't mean detumescence here. You can think of it that way if you like. What we're talking about here is the classic Greek sense, the Aristotelian sense of adynamia, impotentiality, incapacity, inability. And then we're thinking of ways that that incapacity can be stated, expressed, declared. In each case, we see a declaration of impossibility, impotentiality. And these are all names of the real. And when they say, here I can go no further beyond this point, my path is blocked, they put us right on the verge of saying something true. And truth statements for Lacan always ultimately say the same thing. There's this other part that I can't say, which cannot be said. And this is really all I can say about that other part, is that it cannot be said. Here, I believe we see a speaking subject on the verge of silence, a knowing subject on the verge of ignorance, a living subject on the verge of what can only be figured in terms of death. Here is the palpable frontier that Lacan is discussing in this opening lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge. This palpable frontier between knowledge and truth. Which begs the question, how exactly does the analytic discourse play out in this frontier, marked here by the delta of impotence? Well, exactly as we've seen it play out in our previous series. So you can take the same model of discourse that we've been working with, and you can add the terms that transform it into the discourse of the analyst. And it looks like this. I'll put them up together so you can see. In the position of the agent, you have little objet A, which we've discussed, a very slippery one here. In the position of the other, we have the barred subject. What's produced is a new master signifier, a signifier that causes the analysand's speech to grind to a halt because it names something real for them. And then on the other side of this, you have this S2, which is equally enigmatic because it serves at least two functions on the other side of the analysand's mountain range. What does the analyst do in this discourse known as the analytic discourse? Well, you heard me talk about silence, ignorance, and death a second ago. Let me be clear. The analyst plays dumb, deaf, and dead, atop knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. So that's the first way to read that S2, that is the cause of the agency wielded by the analyst. The analyst plays dumb, deaf, and dead as little a, atop S2 as a knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. And you know the reason why I'm putting it that way, because knowledge here as S2 is in the position of truth, which is the cause of anyone's semblance of agency to speak. So the truth of the unconscious is what the analyst knows. And it's that knowledge that they carry with them into analytic experience. But it's a type of knowledge that enables them, paradoxically but productively enough, to play dumb, deaf, and dead atop this knowledge. Here is an analyst who is decidedly attuned and ever responsive to any slip, inconsistency, impotentiality in the neurotic subject's speech and action, inviting ever the analysand to name these moments of inconsistency, impotentiality, slippage, In other words, to come to terms with them, to cough up the signifier that links them all together. Is it the name of the disease from which your cat died? Is it the name of the father that treated you poorly until the age of 10, at which point he dipped? These are the S1s that we see being produced, effected by analytic experience. These are the S1s produced in the analytic discourse. And they are essentially, hear me now, symptoms. S1 is a symptom. Now think back to what you know about the symptom, and you'll be right there. The symptom that is coughed up in analytic experience, positioning the analysand right at the base of a mountain range they hoped they'd never have to encounter. Indeed, this S1 is a symptom on the edge of the analysand's unknown, an expression at the base of a mountain range beyond which knowledge, their knowledge, can only give way to ignorance, their ignorance. And with that ignorance, truth. Here is the other function of S2 in the analytic discourse. It is the unconscious truth. That's what that little S2 means when you couple it with truth. It is the unconscious truth marked by the analysand's ignorance, at least from the other side of the mountain range. When you move into the discourse of the hysteric, one of the things that you see there is that S1 being linked up with the S2s that are the unconscious truths that were previously on the other side of a mountain range. We covered that, so we're not going to get too far into it now. Just hold it in mind and know that that would be how it would unfold from there. I want to make a different claim here, one that we haven't discussed as much. If the analyst knows the truth of the unconscious, what we can now conclude is that the analysand, in moments of symptomatic speech, finds themselves up against unconscious truths of which they themselves are ignorant. Let me say that again because it's crucial, I believe. The analyst knows the truth of the unconscious, but the analysand continually finds themselves up against unconscious truths of which they are ignorant. The psychoanalyst has knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. The analysand experiences ignorance of their unconscious truth. Make no mistake, in the analytic discourse, S2 has less to do with knowledge than it does with truth. If the unconscious truth of the analysand finds partial, limited, enigmatic expression in the symptom, how does the analyst bring the truth of the unconscious into legibility? Not with symptoms, baby, but with mathèmes, formulas, diagrams, and the like. And I want to suggest once more, building on our recently concluded series on Seminar 18, that these analytic formulations, these formulas, these diagrams, these graphs, with all of their lower and uppercase letters, sometimes upside down, sometimes backward, sometimes stricken out, and the like, all of these analytic formulations are precisely what define Lacanian psychoanalytic thought as radical scientific inquiry. Why? Because it's precisely here, at the level of the matheme, the diagram, the graph, the knot, that psychoanalytic thought reaches that which, and I quote Lacan from page 32 here because it's a really crucial passage, arguably the most crucial passage. With these formulas, psychoanalytic thought reaches that which falls within the remit of the term real. In the analysand's symptomatic expressions, We could say that the real takes on a name in the symbolic. It takes a name from and in the symbolic. Not so in the analyst's algebraic, radically scientific formulas. Here we see elements of the symbolic, letters, in contorted form, numbers, in various guises, being used, often in equally enigmatic ways, to give a name to the real. In the analysand's symptoms, the real takes a name in the symbolic. In the analyst's algebraic formulations, the symbolic gives a name to the real. That's what the analyst is up to when engaged in theory, is the assignment of a name to the real that allows them to reach entities, events, experiences, impossibilities that fall within the remit of this term, real. I want to share this passage with you. It's just too key to leave it unread. It's on page 32, toward the end of this opening lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge. The question of the psychoanalyst knowledge is not at all as to whether it is articulated or not. Rather, it's about knowing which place one has to be in order to sustain it. That's this frontier that we're talking about. Where do you have to be in these circles that we've been messing with in order to sustain the psychoanalyst knowledge? I'll try to give you a hint of this, Lacan continues, though I don't know if I'll manage to give it a transmissible formulation. That's what I mean by analytic algebraic formulations, mathèmes, graphs, and the like. These are formulations that, if done well, are transmissible, teachable. You can pass them on, and ideally help people keep shit straight. Isn't that a great irony of Lacan's graph of desire, for instance? It's designed to help people keep things clear, coherent, and accessible, whether you're an analyst or a theorist. But oftentimes, all too often, you open to that page in a Cree and you're just like, what the fuck is this? What's this all about? This is crazy. I can't even... You can. It's not that difficult, but you have to get down to it and work through each of those little algebraic symbols and start linking them up in the way that we've done in our series on the subversion of the subject essay. You got to do the work, and once you do, you suddenly realize the mountaintop you just climbed. Here, in this lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge, Lacan is emphasizing that the work of radical psychoanalytic thought is to come up with transmissible formulations, not unlike a mathematician, that would allow for analytic thought at the level of theory to reach into the real. Notice, the question is to find out what science, to which psychoanalysis may be no more than an attendant, nowadays as in Freud's time, can reach that falls within the remit of the term real. Arguably the most important sentence in this first lecture. However, also one that needs to be broken into two. First and foremost, you have this bit about psychoanalysis being an attendant. I think that it's worth noting that this links up with Lacan's concluding claim on the following page about the Enlightenment, by which he typically means the German Enlightenment. We saw this popping for him also in Seminar 18, the Aufklärung. And what he seems to be doing here is echoing a basic Kantian formula with this kind of false humility assigned to philosophical thought, here psychoanalytic thought, around just being merely the attendant, the one who simply carries the train, the handmaiden, all of these subordinate servant positions, this false humility, this sermo humilis that you often see in Kant's discourse, especially toward the end of his career when he's getting into trouble with the authorities, and what Lacan is here resurrecting. I think this bit on the attendant status of psychoanalytic theory links up with what he's doing on the following page around the Enlightenment and powerlessness. We'll come to that in a second. This other part of the paragraph that I want to discuss is key for us. Read without that interjection about a tendency, it reads as follows. The question is to find out what science can reach that falls within the remit of the term real. The psychoanalyst knowledge of truth of the unconscious shows them, I believe, poised and positioned to name, and in so naming reach into the real, even if only at the level of a formula, an algebraic symbol, a matheme, in short, the letter. Which brings us back to Lacan's claim on page 10 of this terrific opening lecture, that the analytic discourse lies precisely on the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. This is the one we've been working up to. Truth, knowledge, and the analytic discourse. I want to see if we can map out their relationship in a diagram of our own, building on some of our other cartographic theorizations to date. You might want to grab another sheet of paper for this one. Single sheet of paper, again, draw a big circle on it. I'm going to do the same. I'm going to do it with you. I think it's a helpful way to work through this material. And it doesn't have to be a circle. You can draw a square. Shit, I don't care what the shape is. It doesn't matter what the shape is. It can be an amoeba for all I care. The point is you need a shape that has an edge and is a closed circuit. Mine will be more or less like a circle. It really just looks more like a fucked up egg, but you'll see in a second. Draw one of your own, whatever you like. And in the middle of this circle, write the analytic discourse. Little a, addressing barred subject who produces this symptomatic expression S1, and little a operating atop that S2, again with the delta of impotence in the mix. So I hold up my diagram so you can see kind of what it looks like for me. You can also imagine this, though, if you're just listening to what it is I'm saying. So you've got this big circle, and in the middle of it you draw Lacan's typography, his cartography of the analytic discourse, and you put it somewhere in the middle. Remember, we're trying to find that frontier, the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge, where the analytic discourse finds itself. Starting under the S2 in this diagram and ending just above the little a atop it, draw another smaller circle extending from the left of this formula, but still well within that first bigger circle that you drew. And I'll draw mine here so that you could see it. It looks something like this. You just add another little circle, half circle, connecting the S2 to the little a. And if you wanted to add an arrow to that circle from S2 to A, it would be helpful, because what you would then show is that the pathway from cause, truth, to agency as effect would remain. You saw this also when we drew Lacan's theory of discourses. You have here cause or condition and result, the truth that conditions anyone's semblance of agency. So this circle that you just drew is kind of like just another version of that arrow connecting truth to agent in Lacan's theory of discourse. Now for the big change. Start with the barred subject now and end beneath the S1, drawing this circle, a third circle, if you will, that is in between the bigger and the smaller one you just drew. So you start above the barred subject and you end beneath the S1, effectively encompassing the second little circle you drew within a third, again extending off to the left of this formula, but again, still within the larger first circle you drew. And again, if you want to keep the arrow structure in place, you absolutely can. And it works in a way that captures the arrow of productivity. The agent addresses the other and something is produced from that communication. Here what we've done is we've just transformed that arrow of production so that it has to go all the way around. Instead of taking the quick path, now you have this path. But it's still the same directionality. It's not essential that you keep it, but I draw it here so that you know we're not straying too far from the original formulations here. What you now have are effectively 3 circles, one inside the other, and the other inside the first. The largest, outermost circle is knowledge. And it can be accurately imagined as a kind of landmass. I think it's helpful to think of this cartographically, to think about this geographically. The larger outside circle is knowledge. The smallest innermost circle is truth. And I think you can well conceive of this as a lake in that landmass. So the largest circle is land, and in that littlest circle in the middle from S2 to little a, there's truth. And you can think of this as a lake in the midst of this land formation. And if you've got different colored pens and you want to shade all this in and you want to color the lake blue and the land green, that helps as well. Just make sure you have a brown pen ready to mark the beach. The circle in between, extending from the barred subject to S1, this is the one that establishes a frontier, if you will, between knowledge and truth. And I would invite you again, with your brown marker if you've got it, to think of this as a beach, as a coastline, as what Lacan in Seminar 18 calls a littoral zone. Now he likes littoral because it suggests the letter, it suggests litter as in trash. It also marks this coastal region. It's technically, in environmental science, just a description for what happens between low tide and high tide. That space between the low water mark and the high water mark where any large body of water meets any large body of land. We're talking about beaches. When Lacan says the frontier between truth and knowledge, he means the beach between the lake of truth we've just established and the landform of knowledge that encompasses it. Let's consider each of these topographic, geographic features in turn. On land, in this big circle, in the field of knowledge, what you see here is the symbolic, with all of its familiar, egocentric social formations. Consciousness flowers here. And what also takes root, for better and for worse, my friends, are hyper-masculinized, phallocentric forms of surplus enjoyment. We've discussed this, so I just throw that out there so that you can have a pin right where it needs to be. This is a land that Lacan describes in this opening lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge as one of rhetoric, invention, persuasion. What my man Kenneth Burke, best reader of Freud, second only to Lacan, calls the human barnyard. Here we find the dictionary in all of its diction, but also in all of its dickish forms and functions. That's what you find on land. That's what you find in knowledge. What about that lake? That lake, that innermost circle that we just drew, where truth, I told you, resides, and always submerged. Here we encounter the real, and with it the unconscious, in all of their impossibility. This is the realm of sexual enjoyment, not surplus enjoyment, sexual enjoyment, as enjoyment that is forbidden, impossible, prohibited. Here we see the radical ulterior features of what Lacan calls feminine enjoyment as other enjoyment. In place of the social that we saw flowering on land, we now find the sexual, and always in the depths. Grammar, logic, repetition unto death. These are the linguistic structures sunken in our lake of truth. If there's a dictionary here in this lake of truth, man, it's waterlogged. It's half turned to mush. And here I am thinking of detumescence. It is nothing short, as a result, of illegible. If there's a dictionary in the lake of truth, just try opening it before it liquefies in your hands, to say nothing of the challenge that would be required to read it. In place of knowledge, and smack dab in the middle of it, we see what Lacan, toying with Bataille at the start of this lecture, calls non-knowledge. More precisely, what we see, what we have drawn in this innermost circle, is a hole in knowledge. Here is that hole that you've already drawn before. Here is that hole in knowledge. And Lacan describes it exactly as such on page 11. I'm not making this shit up. It's right from the text. You go first, Lady Truth. The true, here's the French, meaning the whole, is just down there, and that's your place. Lady Truth belongs in the hole. That's her place, Lacan says. Okay, the hole down there, okay, we don't need to mess with that too much. All of his quipping aside, this connection between truth and the whole, the true, is incredibly important here. Our lake is just a hole that's filled with water. In the end, this non-knowledge is a trouvaille, namely a find. There's no better when it comes to introducing lasting confusion on a delicate subject. The point in question in psychoanalysis, which I've just called the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. So he repeats his utterance and says, you got to have this hole in place. That's why in this innermost circle, this hole in knowledge, where we see the real, the truth, where we encounter the unconscious, here Lacan is labeling it as the very hole that defines Lady Truth. You've heard me say that Lady Truth always has two parts. There's the part of her that can be said, and the part of her that can't. This hole in knowledge that we find when we draw these three circles the way we just have, this hole marks the field of truth that can't be said, the place where words fail, where signifiers fall apart, crumbling into letters, into litter, into unconscious formations that can only ever wash up on shore, and always in the same busted-ass form, namely as symptoms, and symptoms always attached to bodies. Also a theme that's popping in this opening lecture. Bodies in states of affective intensity. Intensity which, according to Lacan, and I quote from page 23 here, intensity which is the very principle of everything that goes by the name of jouissance. You want to know what it means? Jouissance? It means you need a body. And jouissance is what happens when that body finds itself in a state of affective intensity, which is not the same as being emotionally overwrought. Affect is not emotion. We've known that for decades at this point. But let's get back to the beach. From affective intensity to the beachhead. What is this coastal zone, this littoral zone between the lake of truth and the land of knowledge, the one that if you've been coloring the past few minutes as I've been talking, perhaps you have shaded brown? So here is the green land formation of knowledge. Here's the blue innermost circle of truth. And then in between, you've got this brown land, this brown town, if you will, where the littoral zone opens up. This is that palpable frontier. Between the lake of truth and the land of knowledge, you have this beach, this coastal zone. If you've seen our series on Seminar 18, particularly those lectures again on Chapter 7, you know where I'm headed with this. And if you want to track them down on YouTube, these are the ones that have pictures of beaches. Oh, let me be clear. Paintings of beaches. Oh, let me be precise. Japanese paintings of people on beaches. You'll know them when you see them. Like any coastline, and especially when we consider that of a sea or an ocean, the one we've established between truth and knowledge here, it has two limits. It has two edges. It has two water lines, if you will. There's a low tide line in this beach that touches upon the lake of truth. You could see it right here. The innermost circle relative to the beach is the low tide mark. And then there's a high tide mark further inland. That's what the middle size circle indicates. This is the high tide mark, the furthest the water would wash inland. Now, it's easy to think about this in terms of oceans and coastlines. We've got this smaller diagram to work with, but the principle remains. Rivers can have a littoral zone depending on their size, where you've got a body of water and you've got a mass of land. There will be this frontier between them, defined by a low water mark and a high water mark. The low tide line in our diagram, look carefully, it is occupied by the psychoanalyst. That is precisely why that innermost circle is drawn from little a in the position of the agent, from S2 in the position of truth to little a in the position of the agent. This is the space of the psychoanalyst at that low tide mark. I believe it's here that the radical psychoanalytic thought of folks like Lacan occurs in its most scientific form. This is where the psychoanalytic theorist converts their knowledge about the truth of the unconscious into a series of mathèmes, diagrams, graphs, and algebraic expressions, all of which, when done well according to Lacan, constitute those transmissible formations that we just read about from this opening lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge. How else are we to read Lacan's return to big S next to parens barred capital A in his effort to account for the whole in truth, the whole of truth sustained by knowledge? I'm looking here at page 19. This is what I tried to mark out with my capital S, brackets, capital A, the said A being precisely barred. So here Lacan is thinking of the upper left-hand quadrant of the graph of desire, where you see a capital S next to a barred capital A in parens. At any rate, for those who follow me, you can't say that this at least is not a knowledge, or that it's not to be taken into account as a means of guidance, even if only in the short term. This is the first point regarding the unconscious structured like a language. That capital S next to a barred A in parens, notice all the work we have to do just to spell out what you can plainly see with your eyes because it's in writing. This is what you see at low tide. This is the furthest out to sea that land goes. This is the symbolic at the limits of the real. And with these formulations, you see the psychoanalyst reaching into the real, bringing a name right to it. This is one version of the name of the real that we have discussed. This is one version of what we define as real discourse, discourse which is not a semblance. at least not entirely. At low tide, let me be clear, we see the analytic theorist writing formulas in the sand. It's these formulas, with all their enigmatic letters and symbols backwards, upside down, slashed out like that capital A. It's here with these enigmatic letters and symbols that we can see what psychoanalytic thought is able to reach that falls within the remit of the term real. I can't emphasize this passage enough. Page 32. It's here, at this place and no other, that the psychoanalyst knowledge can be sustained. And not just sustained, hear me now, but transmitted as well, taught even. Here we don't just name the real, we pass this name on to others. Low tides, as you know, they come and go. But high tides often linger, not because the water remains at that high line, but because high tides typically leave traces behind. You can often tell where the high water mark is in any given beach, on any given littoral zone, by the curving, typically parabolic line of debris at the beach's most inland points. These are the traces that high tide leaves behind. Sometimes living organisms wash up, but they don't last long before birds and sunlight and air alike hurry them toward death. Indeed, I would suggest that most of the organic material that washes up at high tide is already fucking dead. It's here, at high tide, designated by the medium-sized circle intersecting with barred subject over S1, that we see the analysand at work, engaged in symptomatic expressions commanded by unconscious truths they know nothing about. This is the part of truth, their truth, that can be said, typically in the form of a death sentence. Here is the final circle that we drew, the high water mark. And it is a circle that designates not the position of the analyst at the lake's edge, but the position of the analysand at the high water mark, established by that lake's relation to land, by truth's relation to knowledge. If the analyst's formulas are where we see the real given a name, it's in the analysand's symptoms that we see the real taking a name, you've heard me say. In both cases, we see semblance and signification at their limit, a limit that allows for real discourse to occur. This is the other type of real discourse that we have. In the speech of the analysand, we see symptomatic expressions commanded by the unconscious, in which the real takes a name in the symbolic. In the analyst's transmissible formulas, mathèmes, diagrams, and the like, we see something different. We see the symbolic marched out to the very limits, the edge of the whole in knowledge, as Lacan puts it in 18. And there we see the analyst as radical scientific inquirer, drawing in the sand, bringing the outer limit of the word in the form of the letter upside down, backwards, and stricken out, right to the edge, where it can reach something in the remit of the real. This is also real discourse, where the real is given a name, assigned a name. Final word, then we're out. It's also Lacan's final word in this lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge at the start of Talking to Brick Walls. The fucked up part about all this is also the greatest blessing. The analysand cannot resist the real. Unconscious truths always will out. The analysand is powerless to resist, even and especially the more they try. And it is this powerlessness, above all, that the psychoanalyst knows. The psychoanalyst knowledge is knowledge of the fact that analysands are powerless to resist the unconscious. Which is ultimately why the knowledge of the psychoanalyst is what Lacan, in the final moments of his opening lecture on the topic, in an apparent response to this bit about the Enlightenment, which you heard me reference earlier, this is why, ultimately, the psychoanalyst knowledge is what Lacan calls the knowledge of powerlessness. Now, this is a wager at the end of our first lecture in this mini-series, that the knowledge of powerlessness, that is the psychoanalyst knowledge, is a knowledge of the fact that the analysand cannot resist the real. It cannot help but cough up a name for it.